Dobar dan once more then. S obzirom na moje ograničene vještine na hrvatskom jeziku, imate slobodu štedjeti vaše uši i obaviti ostalo na engleskom jeziku. So my presentation will be slightly, if not a lot, different from the others you've seen here. The ones I've been observing have been very much about the user experience, where the user means the end user. This is a lot more about the user experience, where the user is what you are, namely coders. So for MariaDB, the user is the developer. And when we talk about developers, we talk about those who code MariaDB itself. So on the past, present, and future of open source databases, a personal journey. This is going to be a personal journey where I go from the very beginning of when I've had anything to do with databases up until today and the future from here onwards. And in order to make it slightly more interesting, I will interweave things like the 70s with today, and then 80s and today. You'll see what it's all about. I'll start by mentioning what MariaDB Foundation is at all. Because how many of you are involved in selecting databases for the applications that you're using? Okay, so it's about half of you that are involved in selecting the database. Let me then ask, how many of you have heard of MariaDB? It's about even a bigger group. So MariaDB is a database which is a fork of MySQL. The database fork happened back in 2009, but the organization I'm representing, MariaDB Foundation, was established later than that in October 2012. Before that, there was some prior history because the person who developed MySQL, namely Monty Mikael Videnius, started MariaDB as a database prior to the organizations that currently are working for it were established. So nowadays we have two things with two entities with MariaDB in their name. It's MariaDB Foundation, and I'm representing MariaDB Foundation as the CEO, and there's about 10 of us. The closest person working for MariaDB Foundation to Split is working in Bosnia, Anel Husakovic. Then we have MariaDB Corporation, and that's about 200 people. And they are a for-profit corporation selling products and services around MariaDB. By contrast, we are a non-profit foundation. So I'm here sort of preaching the evangelism of MariaDB, not caring about whether you're paying customers to any entity, be it MariaDB Corporation or anything else. Our task is to promote the usage of MariaDB server as a database. So that's our normal day-to-day thing. We're promoting the usage, and the other day-to-day thing that we're doing is we're taking contributions from the guys that we call developers, i.e. from big companies that extend the usage or the functionality of MariaDB server. But we have an even bigger task than that, and that's the task of keeping the source code open to ensure that there will always be a MariaDB server regardless of what will happen on a commercial level. We know what happened to MySQL. It is no longer managed by an entity that as its core has open source as a top value, and the purpose of the MariaDB Foundation is to ensure that such a thing will not happen with MariaDB server. So we, on a very practical level, guarantee the free public access to the code repo on GitHub. And that's how you also do your pull requests and enter the contributions to MariaDB server, which we then review and merge and put into the next release of it. But I suspect that most of you here are what we call end users that you are using and not developing MariaDB server itself. So from that perspective, I would like to shed some light on how you compare MariaDB to something else. So MariaDB is one database amongst many, but amongst which ones? So the usual suspect for comparing MariaDB is its ancestor, MySQL. I would challenge you to no longer be primarily comparing MariaDB to that. Instead, think of it as a comparison point to Oracle, Postgres, or MongoDB, or Couchbase. So that's the reference frame in which I think a proper comparison between MariaDB and something else is happening. So out of curiosity, how many of you are involved in Oracle-like projects? I see perhaps a fifth of you. How many with MySQL? Oh, less than a fifth. What about Postgres? A fourth, perhaps? What about Mongo? Not very many. Couchbase? And MariaDB? More hands. Okay, thank you. Good, good. Then I know who I'm talking to. By the way, I have out of these, the thing that you see on the left here on the slide, it's our annual report 2018. And for those of you who are interested, come ask me after the presentation, and I will have some summaries of this. This is about a 20-page thing describing what MariaDB Foundation has accomplished, and of course, the central part of that is technical about what MariaDB server is. So now, going to the distant past, this is before, I would say, 90% of you were born. 1970s, which I was also only slightly born then, but my dad used to work for IBM, and that meant that I was exposed to the IT of that era fairly early. And what I remember from then is something called, well, of course, punch cards. You've heard of that, but that's just a joke here. The antitrust case in the US against IBM, 1969 to 82. That's something that actually has bearing on today, because you see a total dominance of certain actors in the IT space in the US, and they are not being challenged nearly in the same way as they were being challenged, as IBM was being challenged throughout the 70s, where IBM's dominance on the so-called mainframe market was big. And what actually pleases me a lot is to see that this challenging of monopolies is happening from Europe these days. So if somebody is controlling what giants are doing, it's likely somebody sitting in Brussels. Another thing which was interesting, which was my first exposure to proper programming, was through a language called APL, A Programming Language, where everything was in memory. And you can imagine memory wasn't too abundant then. I remember when I went together with Monty, the developer of MySQL and MariaDB, from Finland, where that's my native country, to Sweden, to buy 16 kilobytes of additional memory. So we then had 32 kilobytes, which was, I mean, there was no limit to what you could do then with 32 kilobytes of memory in your processor. So you can imagine the type of processing that could be done in memory then. Now, one of the lessons I've had lately is that I might be too database focused, because I tend to put stuff into a database that doesn't have to be in a database, because now there's so much memory around there. So I'm not a JavaScript guy, I'm rather a Python guy, but the arrays that you can put into Python, the dictionaries, the lists, everything, they can be positively huge, and you need databases for persistence, but not to store everything on in the same manner that used to be the case earlier for databases. So the lessons from these early 70s for today do still exist, though, beyond the ones of punch cards having 80 rows, meaning that many default programming language line widths are 80. I would say that what has reflected itself on modern open source databases, in particular MySQL and MariaDB, is the obsessive attitude towards performance. Because performance was a bottleneck then, the processor capacity was so small that you really had to optimize. We had to look at not the C level, but beyond the C level to the machine code level, code execution. And that you will see in the form of efficiency of both the architecture and the individual functionalities of MariaDB. And jumping from the 70s to a reflection of today, MariaDB Foundation has many members, many corporate members. One of them is IBM, and this is the board representative of IBM Corporation on MariaDB Foundation. His name is Todd Boyd, a very great guy to have on the board. And this is the quote I have there is not a tribute to him personally. I think it's a wise thing to look at the wisdoms of yesterday or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and look at how they apply today. So the way IBM used to dominate, and after that mostly Oracle, was by creating a feeling in the departments who decide for procurement what is going to be used that, well, you might save some money by picking something else, but the safe choice is IBM. Nobody was fired for buying IBM. I think the mentality today is entirely different. This is in no way anti-IBM, because this has been surpassed by, say, Oracle ages ago. I think the responsible attitude these days is nobody was fired for using open source. I think you have today to defend yourself, prove your point. Why do you need to use anything beyond open source in your project? So that's the change of mentality. This nobody was fired for, blah, 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 continues to exist. So another thing from today, before we go back to the history here, is looking at who has done these contributions. So I'm very grateful to IBM for being the largest individual contributor after MariaDB Corporation and after MariaDB Foundation. You probably can't read too much of these pie charts here. The left pie chart is about the number of commits to MariaDB server by organization last year, 2018. The right-hand side is lifetime contributions, 2009 until 18. And the big difference you see there is there's a huge slice here for Oracle. 20% of the code of MariaDB in its lifetime are lines of code or commits that were committed first to MySQL and then applied onto MariaDB. So Oracle is a huge contributor to MariaDB, not just in the form of the original code base, but additions to it, which some people have portrayed as being a dependency on Oracle. Well, guess what? Oracle has 2%. You see the same color there, the red slice on the left-hand side, and IBM is bigger. So there's a great contributor from IBM, Daniel Black, who has contributed lots and lots of commits, pull requests to MariaDB, some of which are related to IBM type platforms, Power 8, Power 9, many of which who are not related, but useful for all of the users of MariaDB. So that was the flashback to 1970s, which for me personally, as a tiny child, was related a lot to Dad working at IBM and reflecting that onto today. So let's now forward to early 80s when I started to do work and earn money myself. What was then important was that the world went towards relational. Prior to relational, there were, of course, databases. People just coded, and they used things called hierarchical databases. It's called IMS here. I might have mentioned it, I might not. No, I did not mention it. Focus 4GL had also a hierarchical database, where on the conceptual level you have parents and children in your database structure. There were also network databases. They were fairly complex, so things were simplified by putting data into constrained concepts called relations, which are basically mathematical sets, and that was a novel concept. Then people were complaining, well, this is not as fast as using hierarchical databases or network databases, which was at the time true, but already at that point, the cost wasn't related so much to the usage of processing power, it was related to coding. And coding simply is much more efficient than coding a complex thing. So what was done in the 80s a lot was cleaning up the raw data from old hierarchical and network databases, where you could enter things that were exceptions all too lightly. And that now is a flashback to NoSQL databases. You could actually say that prior to the advent of DB2 and the 12 rules of EF-COD, everything was NoSQL. Well, obviously it was not SQL, because SQL is equal to more or less relational. So it was NoSQL, and the commonality towards today is that data is not mathematically clean. It's quick and dirty, where quick is good and dirty is less good. So this means that one of the reasons to use a relational database such as MariaDB over a NoSQL database is the cleanliness that is forced upon you by writing stuff into a relation, which lessens the opportunities for mistakes. Yep. And also in the early 80s, the earliest or oldest surviving pieces of MariaDB code were written, and there are a couple of other concepts here which might be of relevance, such as denormalization. Normalization was this third normal form whereby you do the cleanliness of the data, but then to optimize response times, you denormalize. The modern concept for that is column stores. If you want to have quick reporting but do not do real-time updates, column stores are the way to go. And now jumping today, after each of these historic sessions, I'll show one member of the board of MariaDB Foundation. This is Michael Howard, the CEO of MariaDB Corporation, also a member of the board of the foundation. And the quote now this time actually is from him. So the attitude, the value that he's breathing is that MariaDB is the heir apparent to Oracle. Now, I didn't know what an heir apparent is. It's in Swedish, tronföljare, which I knew directly, and I've looked it up. It's presto lonasljednik in Croatian. So Michael Howard used to work for Oracle, and he now is set on, from the side of the corporation, to make sure that MariaDB is the choice for those using Oracle, where you want to lessen your dependence on one big player, so avoidance of vendor lock-in. And I'll illustrate this also by a chart, a beautiful chart. I hope you think it is. So this is a chart which describes the releases of MariaDB, so that you see that, hey, this is a database that didn't come just yesterday. These database things move very, very slowly. So MariaDB was first released in 2009, and the first stable release, GA release, was of MariaDB 5.1 in 2010. And you'll see here the other releases, they are slightly strangely enumerated. So it's 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.5, and then after that we've had 10.0, 10.1, 10.2, 10.3, and 10.4, which means that the 10 set of releases already marks a clear independence of MySQL, whereas the 5 release was close to MySQL. And the blue lines here, you see the amount of releases done per year, and you also see that you see a core value of ours, which is that you're not forced to do upgrades all that easily. We have many parallel versions that you can use, so if you created an application that you don't want to touch, then you can continue to use the old one, because we do, as you see, give support in the form of security updates, even to something that was released as early as 2012, which was MariaDB 5.5. You see, 2012, the first releases, stable releases of 5.5 were done, but you can also see here in the last column that 2019, there was a security release due to some types of security bugs that had existed a long time ago but were uncovered now, so you're not forced to upgrade all that easily. But that said, though, we are making it very easy to update to newer releases without you having to change much in your application. Of course, if you want to take advantage of the new things, yep, that requires coding, but you're not supposed to be dumping old data and reloading it in any new format. I think there has been one format change in the history of combined history of MySQL plus MariaDB in total. So forwarding now to the late 80s, when the prevalent operating system on the small laptops was MS-DOS and PC-DOS. There were lots and lots of databases at that point in time. Some of them were toys, such as Microsoft Access, which didn't have proper level of multi-user control. Others did have it, like Sybase and its inheritant Microsoft SQL Server. And then, of course, DB2 continued to be the big one. And at that point in time, Oracle grew. What also happened in the late 80s was the proper advent of free software or open source through Linux and through GNU. And out of those values, what reflects upon today, you can see something that is really important for MariaDB, which is the storage engine architecture. So the storage engine architecture means that you have two levels of the database. The upper level that understands SQL, and the lower level that implements the SQL and that can store it in various different formats, depending on whether you have a game or something around Internet of Things or a data warehouse, depending on whether you read a lot or write a lot, and depending on whether your writes are mostly inserts or mostly updates and deletes. So you can optimize your application through the right choice of storage engine. There's even a special storage engine called Connect, and the Connect storage engine enables users of MariaDB to connect to non-MariaDB databases, such as Microsoft SQL Server or DB2. A core thing for MariaDB, which comes from the late 80s, is the value of ease of use. Now, ease of use in the 80s was not about JavaScript and optimizing the rendering of things, but it's the ease of use of the database itself. And there was a value when MySQL was created, which was about making it possible within 15 minutes of identifying your will to your interest in testing MySQL until you have a running system. Well, that was before the days of Docker and containers of all the kinds, which has made it easy with any database. But that core aspect of ease of use is still guiding the development of MariaDB. And of course, the value of open source itself and free software foundation. And here, let me symbolize that era with Sudhakar Sanakayala from Microsoft. He's the Microsoft board member of MariaDB Foundation. And I didn't have a quote on that one, but what I think is really, really important to see is that the value of open source is something that is shared by Microsoft these days. That wasn't the case in the late 80s, that wasn't the case during all of the 90s, but now they are a huge contributor to open source, and we are grateful for that. So then we come to the 90s. There's one slide for the 90s, and that was when MySQL was launched. Myself, I was coding with Delphi. Then we didn't have browsers. So this was a Pascal kind of language, and I used the database that went along with it, which was Firebird. But that had some cost things. It wasn't open source, so when we deployed it to our customers, we had to pay, and we were stingy, we were greedy, we didn't want to pay for the database because we thought we created the value. So we were looking around at Postgres, which had academic beginnings. It was a database that was supposed to, and still is a database that is supposed to be able to implement most every aspect of database functionality. And I, of course, knew about MySQL because I was a friend of Monty's already since the 70s, but, well, do you take a serious database that was coded by somebody in academia, or do you take your friend's database? I wonder which one I would pick. So I was very long for Postgres, and Monty then convinced me that this going with MySQL is an easy thing. You can just test it, and of course, if you think that Postgres has the more value, you can easily migrate because the openness of the functionality is such that the migration to something else is not a big threshold. So I did, and not much later, personally, I also then integrated myself into the MySQL AB corporation. So I had a company of my own, and that was then split into two, and I became part of MySQL because I saw that my vision was that the reputation that MySQL had in the early 2000s was one of being a toy database, but actually it had all the aspects of which were needed. People were saying, well, it doesn't have transaction, it's not ACID compliant, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out that this pragmatic way of approaching a database, where you take a core aspect that you really want to get done, you can call it the minimum viable product. If that one works well, and it's bug-free, and it's fast, then that's a good starting point for building something that has more functionality. So, so that was, yeah, and PHP limit 10 here, I wrote that as an example. PHP might not be as big now as it was, but at that point in time, at the late 90s, that was the language that made the web grow. And they had this interesting concept of browsing products on your screen, and you would want to show 10 products, and then you browse onwards and see the following 10 products, which is, of course, a trivial thing for today. But for that point in time, you would store those products in a database, and you would not have them all in memory because it was too much of the memory, and you would then issue a select statement for the 10 items. But there was no syntax in SQL for saying, I just want the 10 first, or I would just want the 10 following ones. You had to do a select star, and the where clause didn't have any aspect for saying that you want a particular slice of it only, which was something that Rasmus Leerdorf, the developer of PHP, said at a conference much like ShiftDev to the developers of MySQL, meaning Monty and David Axmark. And they thought it was a good idea. I can see why people would want that. So then the following morning, Monty hadn't slept all that much, but here's, I don't remember whether it was a memory stick or how he gave it at that point in time, but here you are, dear Rasmus Leerdorf, why don't you try this? Perhaps it's of value for PHP. And if you want to have a singular event that marks why, in the same way as Delphi and Firebird went together, now also MySQL and PHP went together. It was this event of giving the PHP community what they wanted in order to make applications easy to use on the web that marked the marriage or the joint growth of those two, that combination of database and development language. And the symbol of that, for that I picked Monty, Mikael Widenius, who's the CTO of MariaDB Corporation and the founder of both the corporation and the foundation, and a member of the board of MariaDB Foundation. So the quote I have here is not a direct quote by him, but I think it's a fair question to ask. People ask, so what's the difference between MySQL and MariaDB? And when I get that question, I first answer by saying what's not different. So what's in common is that both are open source databases, both use the GPL version 2 license, both were developed with Monty as the lead developer, and both share the same root code base. So up until, so when MariaDB was started, it was started on top of MySQL. So those are the commonalities. The difference is that MySQL is today owned by Oracle. It has closed development, it has few contributors, and it doesn't have a non-profit foundation like the MariaDB Foundation. So being owned by Oracle means that there's near zero likelihood that any functionality will be developed for MySQL that is in competition with Oracle. We have no such constraints, so we do MySQL for MariaDB, and that enables people to migrate off Oracle onto MariaDB. Our development is open, so yes, they do follow the GPL letter of the license, so they release their code, and the code is available on GitHub. But we have a development model where we actively try our best to involve those who want to contribute with new code, and getting a code contribution into the code base of MariaDB server is a technical question. It's not a commercial question. So if the code quality is good enough, it will be in the next release. So that's why we have many contributors, and that's our role as a non-profit foundation. And that has resulted in the picture you see here, where the red curve of MySQL has now, in November last year, crossed the blue curve of MariaDB. This is, well, I'll have to start first by saying that, yes, MySQL is the second biggest database on DB ranking, with Oracle being #1. And yes, at the start of 2018, we were number 17. At the end of last year, we were number 13, and MariaDB is now number 12 on the list of most popular, most used databases in dbranking.com, which is, I think, you always have to have some kind of a proxy or simplified method of ranking databases based on both popularity and sales, and how much it's spoken about on the web and on Stack Overflow and what have you. And there, of course, yes, MySQL is before MariaDB. I've, for one, checked the number of readers of articles on Wikipedia, and depending a bit on language, and I haven't checked for Croatian, but usually MySQL is being read about 3 times as much as MariaDB on Wikipedia. But there are areas where we've already gone past MySQL, and one such is Debian. So those who knew that this was Debian, they have really good eyesight. It says up there, installations of MariaDB and MySQL on Debian. So Debian has something called popularity context. So this popularity context is a pingback thing where their users, based on what packages they have in production use, ping back things to the Debian.org website. And now, in November, the pingbacks of the installed base of MariaDB grew beyond that of MySQL, which, needless to say, makes us proud. So if you expected this talk to be about me somehow coming to the conclusion that MariaDB is the way to go, I think that's what you all expected, and I will not disappoint you. Yes, of course, that will be my conclusion. That's rather evident, but I'm here now also to explain why I think there's a good fundament for saying that. So now we're almost already at this year. We're now in the 2000s, which is when MySQL started in 1995. That's when it was released, based on code that was developed in the early 80s, but it didn't have an SQL layer on top of it yet. 2000 is the year when MySQL went GPL version 2. So it was semi-open source-ish. Until that, the source code was available, but the license was not a known one. It was a MySQL-specific license, and that involved too much explanation. So they went with GPL version 2, which shrunk their sales initially, but grew their adoption so much that the sales within, I think, 9 months came back to the original level. So that was the era of people starting to use open source. Then you still have to defend yourself why you are using open source, and organizations were using it, but not telling the boss. And then after a while, the application was big enough for the organization to depend on it, and then the boss discovered, oh, it's built upon open source, how can that be? I didn't say that's allowed. And that type of growth was what started open source in big organizations. There was a book called Cathedral and Bazaar being written about open source, and LAMP as a concept was coined because all the commercial stacks of the time had some nice catchy abbreviations. So Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, per Python was invented as a moniker, as a name for the stack into which MySQL then belonged. And now, as you saw from this picture here, we call ourselves the new M in the LAMP stack. And it's probably not a coincidence that Monty, for his second daughter, Maria, picked a name that started with the same letter as his first daughter. My actually is the name of Monty's first daughter. So during that decade also then, MySQL grew into something that is not just for web development. It was integrated into SIP R3, almost done until then part of MySQL. The InnoDB engine was bought by Oracle. Not much later than that, Sun Microsystems bought MySQL itself, and then 1 year after that, Oracle bought Sun. So that was then the starting point of why MariaDB was launched. So here, the thing that has implications for today, the first word I picked here with a blue bullet point is unicorns. So MySQL AB was a unicorn, i.e. it was sold for $1 billion to Sun Microsystems. I think then another important bullet here is that today nobody questions open source. Actually, you're almost required in so many contexts to build upon it. It's a core infrastructure component, and the value of it is uncontested, and it's a way to avoid lock-in. And the symbol of this on the board is our developer representative on the board, Sergei Golubchik, who has been developing MariaDB and its ancestors since 1999 or 2000. And there's a quote here that I was very happy to send out on Twitter early this year. You can't read it here, but what it says is, on code contributions, MariaDB beats MySQL 1009 to 247. So we have over 1,000 closed pull requests on GitHub, and we have 179 open, whereas MySQL has only 247 of those. So 4-to-1 lifetime pull requests course, there are, you can argue about details here, but the big trend here is saying that we, in our shorter lifespan, has more than 4 times as many pull requests than MySQL, means that we value contributions, collaboration amongst developer of databases highly. And here, this might actually be a slide that is of most practical relevance to you. So this slide is about the latest versions of MariaDB, helping you to pick databases for your application. Do I want to use Mongo, for instance? Well, of course I want to use Mongo because I need JSON. Well, look at the cell for MariaDB 10.2 here, the column SQL and basics. So the second bottommost row, it has JSON there. Well, of course, you cannot expect MariaDB to have an identical support of JSON to something like Mongo. But if your task is, or if your desire is to be able to store JSON in a database and still keep it clean in the form of a relation, you can do that. And you can, in your select statement, use JSON-like commands so that you don't need to select first all of the JSON things and then process them in memory. You can actually have statements, select statements, which parse the JSON itself. You have parallel replication here in MariaDB 10.1. You have data at rest encryption. You have other types of security things like, and this is now in 10.4 up in the rightmost corner, top rightmost corner for various audit plugins and authentication and privilege systems over SSL. I think this is a slide that you might want to take a look at. I do understand that your key concern is not, does it support all of Oracle's PL SQL values? How good is the Oracle compatibility mode? Is probably not your highest concern, but that's an example of what we've been doing. There's system versioning, meaning tables where you have the history value so that you can take a select statement as of last week or as of 6 months ago directly as part of the system. And that can then be done using replication so that your production system is not burdened with tracking all the old versions of the data, but a replica of it is. So when you then need to go back and see who screwed up the content of the database or what was it before it was screwed up, you can reconstruct things based on stuff that is directly online instead of going to an old backup version. It's directly there, and you can use your normal select syntax, just add the word as of and identify the timestamp of that data. So there are sequences. There's various ways of using replication with Galera. There's types of backup here, and there's functionality related to instant changes of database structure. Usually adding a column meant that you had to dump the old data and then in the new format, including a new column, reload it, which of course meant that you have depending on the size of the data, you have a long window of not being able to do concurrent updates. Well, there's an instant version of that in MariaDB 10.3, and we grow the number of things that you can do all to table with without needing to take down your database in 10.4. And that's also part of this annual report that I promised to those of you who come and grab me. I have it up in my room. I don't have it here, but you'll get it if you ask for it. So now we come to today, 2010, the era of MariaDB. It was originally founded as 2 companies, SkySQL, SkySQL Corporation, and Monty Program, which were then merged in 2013. Purpose is to avoid lock-in. The corporation then has done things independent of the foundation, such as creating software that is not open source, that follows the so-called business source licensing. MaxScale is a proxy that reads the SQL level syntax and can do distribution, load distribution, and can do security things on top of the code without having to burden the database with it. that's not part of the scope of the MariaDB Foundation. That is something that the corporation is doing. A very important thing today is that MariaDB Foundation is no longer just something started out of Finland or starting out of Finland plus IBM and Microsoft and a couple of big contributors from Europe and the US. China has become ever more important for us, with Alibaba being the first and Tencent the second platinum sponsor of MariaDB Foundation. The key is here, and that's the red, the round blue thing that you've been seeing here on the slides, the CD here. It has, as its leftmost side, free public access. That's the core reason why we were established. It then has promoting the development of MariaDB server, meaning the foundation with 10 people doesn't do much of the development. Others do, in particular the corporation, but we promote it in the corporation at Alibaba, at IBM, at Tencent, and so on. We are the advocates. We promote the adoption of MariaDB, and we try our best to foster collaboration between users, meaning you, and developers, meaning those at the big sponsors of the foundation who create new functionality for MariaDB server. And the symbol of this here is Qingling Zhang from Tencent Cloud, a member of the board. And the quote here for him is related to a concept that we have twice a year at MariaDB Foundation, and that's an unconference with 50 to 100 people. Last one we had was in New York in February, and the next one will be in Shanghai in November, mostly with Chinese, but of course everybody is welcome. And that will then influence the roadmap of upcoming releases of MariaDB, and it's a great place to get your contributions entered into the next version of MariaDB server. So that's I see a number here, 27 seconds left, so that was more luck than it was truly planning. But anyway, hvala lijepa, and you will see here how to contact us.